So this happened at least 2 years ago when I was home alone, and this was back when I used to live with both my parents. It was shortly before my mom and dad had separated, and this is by far one of the strangest things that's ever happened. I was home alone as I had no school or anything like that, as my moving day was fast approaching. And with that being the case, my dad was at work while my mom had to go out and do some errands. My brother was in school, so I was basically home alone with my dog Bear. As I was home alone, I just usually did my usual thing. I'd play on the computer, sometimes play on my Xbox, and I sometimes goes as talking to one of my friends online. The house was actually pretty neat and decent. However, it was not the best neighborhood to live in because you would get some people who were pretty nasty here and there, and you would occasionally, have problems with certain neighbors. But other than that, it was something else that I really didn't understand and why people were being rude at that time. But I guess you could say it's kind of something else. Okay, so while I was home alone, I was just chilling on my computer, doing what I usually do, when suddenly I looked over and I noticed someone or something in the distance. It was a few distance from my house, but it was during the day. Who was this person? I wondered. I walked over to the person, but I couldn't get any word about what this person was saying. Of course, he was across from where I was, but I didn't get a really good idea of what this guy actually looked like. He was looking rather suspicious. He seemed to be looking at me as if he didn't know who I was, and I was just very weird. He'd been acting very strange, so, of course, with that being the case, I could definitely say it was quite interesting. I ended up deciding just to do my usual thing and just ignore the guy. But when I looked over, I could see that man was just standing not far from my driveway. Now this was starting to get very strange as I never seen him. But of course, I asked my dad about the person, and my dad asked me about how this guy was there and what to describe him. By the time I got my dad to, well, by the time I hung up with my dad, I ended up looking, but I could see that there was no one there, and that was very strange as I went outside, but I couldn't find anybody out there. When the police did show up, though, they searched around the neighborhood, but they couldn't find them, and that was just very curious to know. It was something that I really did not understand. Who is this person? Why were they there? And etc. Of course, the police had patrolled the area, but they never saw that man, and I never saw him before I left, so it was hard to say. What was this guy doing? And why was he just wandering around the area near my house? That was a question that I've been wanting to know. Alright, so sometime in 2011, this happened to one of my friends, which we'll call her Laura. Laura was 19 years old at the time, and she was in university. And of course, she had a new upgrade to her cell phone around sometime in July, and this was just shortly when she was starting university. She was at her dorm with a bunch of other people, mainly girls that she remembered from high school, and even new friends. However, Laura was a very smart girl and she wanted to become a teacher, which is why she was studying. In the other words, that she had got into what seems to be a university, but it was very hard to get to, so she really had to study as hard as she could. One day she was just usually doing her usual thing at the dorm. She was alone that afternoon. Of course, you would have to say she was kind of home alone as she was in a certain city that had a very good university, but it was hard to get there though. So it was very hard for her to sit there and actually do something that she wanted to do. Surprisingly though, it was at this moment when she looked over to realize that she saw somebody outside, but she just brushed it off as nothing. Then suddenly her phone began to ring. Her cell phone began to ring, and she looked, and it was a number that she had not noticed before. She thought it might have been a scam call, probably just coming around just to prank her just for the fun of it or something like that. So she picked up the cell phone. "Hello?" she asked. But unfortunately there was no answer, and that's when Laura got very confused as to why was there no answer on the other side. She ended up saying hello, but there was no answer, so she ended up hanging up the phone. A few minutes later, her cell phone rang again, and this time it was the same number as before, but she didn't recognize the number. And this was very strange, as she never recognized the number, but she didn't know who would be calling her. So she picked up again, and this time saying, "Hello, do you need my help?" she said. But there was still nothing on the phone, and there was no answer, so it she wouldn't know who was calling on the other end. Maybe it might have been some person prank calling, which she has gotten those a lot, and she gets very annoyed when people like to prank call her. She sighed and hung up as nobody answered, but of course the number called again. This time, she ended up taking down the number, writing it down as quick as she could. She picked it up again, but this time there was still no answer. And this was actually something that she never expected to hear. With that said, she was very tired of it, and so she ended up going to the school faculty and showed them the number that was calling. They called the security and the police, and they tried to trace the number, but unfortunately they couldn't really find out who was the one calling her, as it looked like it came from a payphone. Although it was traceable, there was still no telling on who it was, but it was from a certain area of the city she was in. But Laura had no idea, as nobody spoke into that number, and Laura had never had that phone call like that ever again. And of course, it was actually something to say that right now, that she never expected this to happen. Although it's been a few years now, she had never seen, or at least heard of that number calling her again. But she still wondered about who was calling her, but she never really got to see that, as that never really happened again. But of course, she thought that what she witnessed that one day was completely paranormal. About at least sometime in 2016, this happened to one of my friends named Alex while he was home alone. He was 15 at the time of the story, and he was home alone as both his parents worked the night shifts, and due to his older brother in college, he was basically home alone for most of the day. When Alex got home from school, he usually would sometimes work on homework, occasionally he would play Smash Bros, or sometimes he would just have friends over. As one day he was just playing video games, as he was playing on Xbox Live with his best friend named Tristan, he ended up hearing a knock at the door. He didn't know who it was at first, so he got up to answer it, and when he opened up, he said, can I help you?" There was a woman who looked exactly like Alex's age, but of course she looked like she was wearing a tank top. She was around maybe 5'2" and medium build, and she seemed pretty friendly enough. She looked really interesting, so Alex said, do you need help with something?" That's when the woman looked at Alex and said, "My boyfriend kicked me out of the house. Will it be alright if you'll let me in?" But Alex did not know if this girl was actually telling the truth or was trying to lure him into doing something. But if this girl did need help, why couldn't she just go to the police or something? And why would her boyfriend kick her out? "I could call the police if that's what you want," Alex replied, but the girl repeated the same phrase that had been done before. "My boyfriend kicked me out of the house. Would you not mind if you let me in your house?" Now this is when Alex realized that it tells him that something was not right, and means he has to make sure the woman does not come in the house. Sorry ma'am," he said. I'm not understanding what you mean by repeating the same thing. I could call the police if you want." But with that said, the woman said that same line again, and this is when Alex thought that enough was enough. He eventually said, no, and of course she said, "You made the right decision." Alex, of course, called the police, but when the police arrived, the woman was already gone, and they never found her in that neighborhood. They patrolled the area all night, but they still couldn't find them. So that was definitely something that they had no idea. They looked everywhere, but they still couldn't find them. And that was honestly something that they were not really sure if they would be able to find this woman or something. And that was something Alex would never forget. Alex would never forget that day when that woman actually went over to that house and asked him to let him in. If he let her in, chances were that something strange would definitely happen. And certainly something with that woman was definitely not good. He never seen her since then, but he still wonders about this woman, if she was still around, and if she did know somebody, and why would her brother kick her out? That still questioned Alex to this very day every time he looks at it. Back when my dad was pretty young at the time, maybe around 19 or 20 years old, when my grandma from his side, which was his mom, was alone. This was honestly something that he honestly can't remember why actually it was what was the case with this. Now, they did have a basement at the house where my dad used to live with his sister, his brother, and his mom, my grandma from his side. Now, this was honestly pretty disturbing and freaky. Now, with that being the case, my dad was just home alone one day as his mom, my grandma, was out doing her thing. I think it was physio. But when his mom was doing physio, he was alone as his sister was working, and same with his brother, and my dad happened to have the day off. Now, since this story took place before my mom had me and my brother, he was basically doing his usual thing about doing usually the other stuff. But of course, with this, to be honest, was actually something that really was curious as to what was going on. Now, my dad was just usually doing his usual thing. When he looked downstairs and he could see that there was there was somebody or something down the stairs to the basement. Now, my dad was not that great on when it comes to basements, but with that being said, he ended up walking downstairs, and when he got to the bottom of the steps, he looked around, but he couldn't see anything. But he swore he might have heard something. He looked at the basement as he turned on the lights, but then he saw a shadowy figure. He couldn't really tell if it was a child, a man, or a woman. Based on what it was something that he didn't expect. Excuse me, hello? Is anyone down here? My dad called. But since there was no answer, he looked over to see what that shadow was. And of course, whoever was the shadow looked up at my dad and smiled. He smiled as if nothing really happened. And that's when my dad realized something was not right. Of course, with that being the case, my dad ended up looking over to see that man looked really unsettling, or whatever it was. It was basically a black figure, but he couldn't really get what the detections or what it looked like. So my dad ended up going upstairs, shutting the basement door, and calling the cops. When the cops arrived and went down there to look, they couldn't find anybody. But when my dad finally went down there with his mom to show him when she got back, they couldn't find whoever that figure was. And that was also something that really chilled him. It might have been something straight out of a horror movie, but he couldn't really put his finger on it. Whoever that person was definitely not what he seemed to happen. His grandma, my nana, his mom, my grandma, didn't really know what that thing was. But of course, my dad never went into that basement alone again. And whenever he did go down, he was always with someone. But as he got older, he wasn't really scared of basement really much, and that fear nightmare went away, thankfully. And he's never had that issue or problem since then. And I just hope it stays that way as much as he wants it to be.